Good afternoon. Today I'm joined by Bruce Dugan, CEO of Inicia Incorporated, as well as several other public and private companies. Bruce describes himself as a creative entrepreneur who, for the last 18 years, has founded and operated logistics companies. He's also a published songwriter, author, magazine columnist, and reporter. Bruce, welcome. To kick things off, given your incredible background and track record, is there anything you can't do?
There's plenty of things that I can't do. I just to correct the record though, it's Inicia. It's a Inicia. Spanish word, and it means to begin. Because when I incorporated Inicia, I was living in Argentina, and I had contracted a programmer to do some work for me, and then about 6 months in, we decided to start a company together. So it just seemed apropos, to begin. So it's Inicia.
Inicia, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It's like I had all my American friends, I have to correct them all the time. And the one thing about foreign language, especially like French and Spanish, is the vowels remain constant all the time. They're always the same, as opposed to like in English, where we have long vowels and short vowels and some vowels that don't make any sense. There's a consistent all the time. So if you understand the sound of the letters, you can read anything always. Anyway, all right. Having said that, so yeah, I spent about 20 years in the freight industry, doing very unconventional things. So we were, we had a lot of Fortune 100 clients like DuPont and Jaguar and Ford and I don't know. There's a whole list of stuff. We did most of the big commercial carpet transportation across the country in the U.S. We set up distribution, same-day paper distribution centers for American Express and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. We did that through a third-party sales agent. And we did things that were unconventional in the sense that when we set up these 28 distribution centers across the country for same-day paper, they wanted the ability to price it differently than freight was priced back in the day. So, back then, everything was done by weight, and they wanted it done by ream. So we had to completely build out an entire pricing matrix based on distance and amount and things like that. So we did things like that. We did relocations, 800 truckloads of relocation for Rubbermaid when they were relocating their warehouse. We did a lot of trade show delivery, which was all just in time kind of stuff. Like if you miss the window, they don't get in the trade show, and then they'd blown
high stakes,
however, whatever they did. So that was it. That was my freight background, and then I transitioned out. I transitioned out of it after like 18 years or so into entertainment, and then I segued out of that into media and technology. So that's the short version.
Great. Well, thank you for that background and introduction. So the topic of today's podcast is why logistics leaders are rethinking those traditional supply chains. And given that fundamental shift, I'd really like to start off by maybe, you have just such a vast amount of experience. With your perspective, what are some of the most common pitfalls you've seen or limitations with that traditional linear supply chain that are making companies really vulnerable in today's global landscape?
Well, I mean, there's two things to clarify. One is that transportation in general, transportation leadership in general, has always been behind the curve, especially in technology. And number two, the way supply chain works in the freight business, especially like the ground freight industry, changes based on the way the industry works. So as an example, at one time, the freight industry was completely regulated, right? So freight brokers like myself, we were technically outside the law for all intent purposes, right? And we were using irregular route carriers who were licensed. We were using, and those were the guys that did mostly like, they would bring the refrigeration products from the West Coast into the East Coast, as an example. And then they come in at a Greenpoint or Hunts Point, and then we turn them around and we'd give them the back loads back. And we'd build loads to do that. So traditionally, the mainline carriers, which now they're all the same company, but Roadway and Yellow and Consolidated Freightways, they were all different companies. And then there was a lot of small regional carriers, but they all worked in the same way, which was they would go out and they would do a local pickup, they'd bring it back to a warehouse, they consolidate it, they'd move that down the line, say to Ohio, and then they'd break bulk it. Anything that's going out into the Ohio area would get offloaded. Anything that was going further west would get onloaded, and so forth and so on. So as an example, a typical shipment that was going from New York to Chicago would take 4 days. We would do it overnight. DuPont would give us 10,000 pounds and we'd deliver it the next day. And ironically, for years, within a day or two, Wilmington, the headquarters of DuPont, would call the plant manager in New Jersey and say, "Who's this Worldway Freight Systems? They're not on the approved carrier list." And he would say to him, "Is there anybody on the approved carrier list that could take 10,000 pounds, get it overnight to Chicago? Because we had a line that was going down. We needed the product there." "No, we don't have anybody." "When you get somebody, you let me know. I'll use them." And this went on for years until he retired. Anyway, so supply chain, a lot of it has to do with regulation. A lot of it has to do with how the law works and so forth. As the freight system started to get deregulated, the whole industry started leaning into what we were doing back in the 80s, right? That didn't exist in the real world of freight. It didn't exist, but behind the scenes it did. You get what I'm saying? And there's a lot of things that goes on in transportation in kind of a gray area where the carrier you hire is not necessarily the carrier that's going to deliver you freight. There's a lot of deals that go on behind the scene. So another example of that was when we were first hired to do the Ford. There was a trade show up in Montreal. So the exhibit house had called us up, and we bid on this big job, like 10 truckloads or something, up into Montreal. And the guy calls me back and he says, "Listen, I'm going to give you this job, and if you do it right, we're going to do business for a long time. If you fuck this up, lose my number." So the day of the job, I was a little company back then. This is the early 80s now. So I was in my 20s or something. I was a little company. I had only a couple of employees, but I had hundreds of trucking companies that I contracted. So I show up on a Saturday morning, and he says to me, "Where are your trucks?" I said, "What time is it?" 10 to 10. "What time are they supposed to be here?" 10 o'clock. All right, take a breath. So about, 5 minutes later or something, trucks come rolling around the bend. And he looks at them and he goes, "What's Burlington Motor Freight doing here?" I said, "I contracted them." "Wait," and he looked at me. He said, "What do you mean?" "They bid against you. You outbid them. How did you outbid them and hire them?" I said, "Listen, I don't tell you how to make exhibits. Don't tell me how to do what I do." Okay. So we used to do a lot of things behind the scenes, where frontline carriers would work behind the scenes for us quietly, privately. They would never disclose what we paid to them to the public because it would erode their base. So there's all these kinds of things that would shift that impacted how supply chains worked. And it's like, Walmart was one of the early adopters of like just-in-time inventory, right? Where they didn't stock, 7 months worth of product and deliver. They would schedule their flow in accordance with what they're selling. Right? Follow what I'm saying?
Yep.
So things have shifted more to that just-in-time and direct point-to-point over the last 20 years. it's gotten more and more and more and more in that realm, right? So that traditional, brake bolt distribution concept has gotten stripped down further and further and further and further. It's got leaner and leaner and leaner and leaner.
Mhm.
Does that help?
It does. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Now, with that, so beyond maybe just the everyday lack of visibility in some of the traditional supply chain models, what else would you say prevents companies from really achieving optimal performance or has previously prevented them from achieving that performance?
Are you talking about trucking companies now?
Sure. Again, would love to hear just from your experience. So, keep it to your personal experience is fine.
Well, keep in mind my experience is maybe outdated. It may not be because, like I said, the industry changes very, very slowly.
Mhm.
But my experience was um, a lot of the freight industry leaders, to my experience, didn't understand the psychology of how the industry ran, and they certainly a lot of them were not aware of that gray area I told you about that
Mhm.
exists. And when you use the word logistics, we're a logistics company. They're really freight brokers for all their
Mhm.
purposes. They're
Right.
subcontracting stuff. They may have their own warehouse, but they're basically subcontracting stuff. So they've become the legitimized word of what we were, 20 years ago.
Mhm.
Um, but the industry was always very slow to look into. Um, they all kind of copied each other instead of innovating on their own. And they didn't understand the psychology of how things ran. Back in the day, we came up with an idea called AFX, the American Freight Exchange, which was going to be like this supercharged multi-location freight brokerage operation. And it was way ahead of its time. The internet wasn't even developed for the public yet. Like
Mhm.
nobody was even using the internet yet. And I went to EDI, which was one of Ross Perot's companies, or maybe his only company, I don't know. And I sat down with the vice president of transportation, and I think it was transportation travel, if I'm not mistaken. And they were building some kind of an exchange. And he said to me, well, we're doing something like that because I was bringing the idea to them to develop this together. And he said, well, we've built something like that, and we reached out to JB Hunt and Schneider and a couple of the other big, truckload carriers to test it out. And I said to him, I said, yeah, I said, that's not going to work. And he kind of shook his head. He goes, yeah, they wouldn't sign on. And it's because they didn't understand the psychology of how the industry works. Like
Mhm.
nobody wants to be a commodity. Everybody wants to keep their brand and all that stuff. So the only way you can take away their brand and make them a commodity is if you do it in private. So the public never knows that they're being used as a commodity.
Mhm.
So it's kind of um, that's the one thing that a lot of them miss is the motivating factor of why companies do what they do and why they make the deals that they make. Um, and the other thing is that a lot of them missed common logical details
Mhm.
about just the general workflow from beginning to end. The transportation industry can get very, very detailed. Like, in other words, they get very detailed when it comes down to the bills of lading and the manifests and and the other types of things. Like the manifest is a list of the individual bills of lading that are consolidated on a truck, right?
Right.
And they'll get into the weeds with that stuff, um, and shipping numbers and PO numbers and bill lading numbers and all that other stuff, and they'll miss the basic, where's my truck right now? Now that's over the years, it's changed, obviously,
Yeah.
because now you got mobile phones with tracking and all this kind of stuff. And
Mhm.
technology over the I'd say last 8 years is really coming to the forefront. You have a
Mhm.
lot of online tracking software now and interaction software, shippers with carriers and things of that nature. So it's changing now where just the general mobile phone does the thinking for them that they've
Mhm.
been missing. But like back in the 90s, there wasn't mobile phones weren't really what they are today, right? They're not the
Right.
mini computers that they were today. But we had built into our computer system where our drivers once a day, it didn't matter where they were, but like when they would stop to eat, or they would stop to hit the men's room, or they would stop for the night to sleep, they'd go to a payphone and they dial into a number, and then they'd be taken through a message system. Press 1 for this, press 2 for that, blah, 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 blah. And that would update our computers to where they were. So in the morning, our dispatchers would do a printout, and they know where every truck in the fleet was and whether they were on schedule or off schedule. Like that, you know what I mean? Where we did a lot of preemptive tracking, which a lot of carriers didn't do. And I used to, when I used to deal with these big companies, like I would deal with Burlington Motor Freight as an example. I would deal with Conway, which was a huge subdivision of another company. And I would give them contracted work, whether it be for one shipment or a dozen shipments. But there was a caveat, and the caveat was, I'll give you this job, but like Burlington Motor Freight, I'll give you this job. However, I need the mobile phone number for your drivers, and they will answer directly to us. They can call you second. I don't care.
Mhm.
But we hear directly from the driver. I don't want to hear relay through your dispatcher. And the reason for that is because dispatchers always lied. You know, we had multiple times where we would have big jobs and the dispatcher would say, oh, no, yeah, he's on his way, he's around the corner. Because he knew that the guy had disappeared and they're trying to find him, so they're stalling us.
Right.
So early on, it's like we deal directly with the driver, right? So things like that. There were always little gaps in the transportation industry when it came to that. Honesty was a big fucking problem. And that was the way we circumvented that, was
Mhm.
because the drivers were always straight up. Drivers would tell you straight up. We would talk to drivers and say, hey, so where are you? Oh, this and that and that. And I blew the up. And we'd say, we spoke to the dashboard. You guys lie like crazy. You know, I told the guy, I blew a tire. I'm going to be down for 3 hours, you know, like that kind of thing. So
Mhm.
the drivers are always pretty straight up guys, and that's why we dealt with them directly. I went off on a tangent. I forgot what your question was now, and if I covered it or not.
You did. Thank you. And you touched on it here a little bit, both, your own technological innovations as well as what you've seen in the industry. So I would like to pivot now and talk a little bit more about, as an industry, what some of those emerging trends and how Inicia is responding to those. So as the logistics leaders are rethinking their approach, what are some of the most exciting trends that you're seeing now to building more agile supply chains?
Well, a lot of the supply chain itself, um, again, um, is a ship. It moves slowly, it turns slowly. But the thing that's going to probably affect supply chain just in terms of its efficiency factor, not necessarily in regard to its structural change, right? There's only so much you can do with physical supply chain, right?
Right.
Where you warehouse product, how much product you warehouse, how you set up your inventory, how you set up your purchasing, those kinds of things. there's only so much you can do in terms of physical location of product and transport of product. Obviously, just in time and direct delivery have been the trend over the last 20 years, and people are trying to continue to optimize that. The big impact is going to come from technology. Obviously, because technology can do things that the human mind, not that the human mind can't do, but it can do it faster and more efficiently. Computers have been changing transportation over the last 20 years, albeit the leaders have been very slow to deploy new things. But AI is going to have a huge impact on the way in which information flows. And I what I see is the original concept we had of American Freight Exchange, 25 years ago, is what's starting to play out in the industry. You're going to have, and you already do now have, a lot of platforms that will connect independent shippers to independent carriers. Now, to the degree that they do like a full 360 workflow, I mean, I haven't been online and tried every single one out there. I would venture to say that none of them have done the 360 yet. And I don't know that, I think at some point in time, there's going to be a centralized rail station of information where there's going to be a central place where you can go on and you can transact your business in any which way that you want to. Whether or not you're subcontracting somebody to do local transportation, you're subcontracting somebody to do container pickups at the pier, or consolidation, or warehousing, or over-the-road transportation, or just-in-time transportation, there'll be a central hub where there'll be all kinds of independent things going on within that network, which is kind of what our AFX platform is. Ours is geared specifically for intermediary, which is another fancy word for freight brokers. The guys in the middle that are, putting all the pieces together that normally don't go together. Like, for example, when shippers have a platform where they can go out and they can hire carriers directly, right? Whether it's Roadrunner, or it's Schneider, or it's JB Hunt, or it's an LTL specialist, or whatever the thing may be, they're never going to find the efficiency that a freight broker or a quote unquote a real logistics company with freight brokerage experience can provide for them. They're never going to get the height of that. In fact, when we were doing work for DuPont, and after the plant manager retired, I went to Wilmington directly. We had been doing business with them for 3 years. And I went to Wilmington directly, and I went into an office where these two guys were sitting. They had all these logistics certificates hanging behind them, and they were the head of logistics department for Wilmington. And I got down there for a while, and we were chatting for a while, and I didn't fit the criteria of their approved carrier list. And I said to them, look, I've been doing direct point-to-point LTL for you guys for 3 years. I've never missed a delivery. I've been outperforming your carriers day in and day out. And I'm cheaper than they are. So I don't know what else you want me to do for you. And what I realized was, about halfway into the meeting, halfway in, they didn't call me down there to get me on the approved carrier list. They came down there to figure out how I was doing what I was doing. That's what they brought me down there for. And we got about halfway into that. And I leaned forward, and they weren't much older than me. I was in my 20s, my late 20s, and I was a young, arrogant guy. Not mean. I wasn't a mean, arrogant guy, but I was kind of full of myself, because I was, I started a little company with $10,000 and blew into this multi-million-dollar company, and we were outperforming all these big industry leaders, right?
Mhm.
So I was kind of full of myself, and so I said to the guy, "You want to know how we do what we do?" And they perked up, and I leaned in like this. I said, "I'm going to tell you exactly how we do what we do. When you fucking pay me, I will teach you." Like that. And they were stunned. And I got him. And I told him, "Hey, have a nice day." And I left, I just left because it was so apparent. I'm not
Right.
getting any more work out of these guys. But the answer to that original question, how are things going to change and what's the trend? The trend is obviously is going to be AI, and it's going to be more and more intermediaries that specialize in different areas of things. Like when we did trade show is a specialized thing unto itself. It's
Mhm.
not like regular ground freight, right? There are certain caveats and things you need to know about it. When we were doing warehouse relocations, that's a specialized thing. It's not just having trucks show up and you're done, right? All these different areas are specialized, and you're going to have more and more people that specialize in different narrow lanes. And there needs to be a place where all of these specialists can reside, and shippers can tap into their areas of specialty,
Mhm.
right? Without having 97 different vendors. So I think you're going to see more and more of that. I think, but we'll see.
Well, last question. Seems like AI is the buzzword right now. Everyone's slapping AI on everything, whether it applies or not. But if a company that you're talking to, CEO says, "Hey, Bruce, I'm really interested in implementing one of these technologies. Where do I start?" What would you tell someone looking for, the first step in innovation?
There's a couple of caveats. The first thing I would tell transportation guys is if you want to deploy technology in your business, finding a credible programmer or technologist
Mhm.
is not unto itself the answer. Um, and the example that I use is going back to the early launch of the internet. Okay. Go back to 2000, 2001. And why did all those internet companies crash? And the answer is it's not because they didn't build really cool shit.
Mhm.
It's because technologists built a lot of cool shit for industries they knew nothing about, and therefore they weren't actually productive for anybody.
Mhm.
So if you're going to use technology, you have to have technology that scales, not just technology that works. That's number one.
Mhm.
Okay. And that's always been my problem with the Indians, right? And I have an office in India. I have staff in India. Um, and I lived in India for 6 years. Um, the Indians have a lot of programmers, a lot of software engineers, and almost any of them can build stuff to work. Not all of them can build stuff to scale. All the best of them are usually grabbed right away by the big companies, Microsoft, Sun, like that. They all have
Right.
campuses at Yahoo. They all have campuses in Bangalore. So the first thing is, yes, you need to have really good programmers that can build a platform to scale so it doesn't crash on you when you start getting volume. But the other thing is you have to have somebody who can wrap their brain around how your industry segment works. Whichever part of the transportation industry you're in, you have to have somebody that understands how it works. If you're in the truckload industry, there's a different mindset, a different motivation, a different protocol than if you're in the LTL industry. if you're in the container industry, if you're in the trade show industry, if you're in the distribution, if you're in the just-in-time, they're all different kind of specialties, and there are caveats and knowledge-based things that you need to address for all of those things. The secondary thing that I would say is the where to start is the first thing you have to do is you have to identify what your goal is, right? What's your goal?
Right.
And for some, it might be, I want to make my information process smoother. I want to be able to engage with my customers better. There's different types of, I want to become more cost effective. There's different types of goals. And the goals will depict what type of technology you need and whether or not there's technology off the shelf you can find or not. And I do the same thing like with our technology clients who come to us and they'll say, hey, what do you have, that can do this type of thing? And I'll say, what are your goals? Right? We have a client right now we're building something for. It doesn't exist anywhere in the world. So, I say to them, what do you want this thing to do? Right? And then every time we get into a new module, they'll say, well, why can't we do this? I'll say, because what it is you want to do, how you want your members to interact doesn't exist anywhere on the planet. So there's no plug and play for what you want.
Right.
Why can't we just integrate this? Because what you want to do does not exist. So there's no other third-party platform that's built to do what you want. And when we want it, there's certain things we can integrate with them. Like, for example, accounting, their accounting software, we can integrate into their platform. So like if a transportation company wants to have a better operating dispatch system, they don't necessarily have to rebuild their accounting system in that platform because there's no sense reinventing the wheel. You can use API, which is a way for computers to talk to each other, and you can just map out those fields so that they can talk to one another. But if you're trying to map out a field that doesn't exist on the planet anywhere, you can't map that to a third party because it doesn't exist in that third party.
Right.
You get where I'm going, right?
Yep.
So it's like that. I would tell them, figure out what it is you really want to achieve, right? Then you got to find somebody who really understands both worlds. And then thirdly, you got to make sure that the programmers that you're going to use or the programmers who have built the platform you're going to use have or can build it to scale so that if you grow, it doesn't crash on you.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Bruce. I really appreciate your insights. I know our clients are going to get a ton of value out of this podcast. I really do appreciate your time today. This has been a great conversation.